Awesome. Okay. So, build your zombie survival kit. Threat-informed defense for real-world attacks. Okay, so a bit about me. So I'm Kade. If you cannot tell by my slightly militarized outfit, I'm a survivor of the zombie apocalypse. I've been working in cybersecurity for about 8 years now, and I have founded my own threat intelligence firm called Arachne Digital, and we are running a threat intelligence program, but we're also starting a program called the Threat-Informed Defense Alliance. So Threat-Informed Defense is something that's very close to our heart, and it's something that we are very, very keen on evangelizing. So we have some links there. These slides also should be available after if people are at all interested. Okay, so how did the zombie apocalypse happen? Everyone knew zombies were slow. Now, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which was 1965, so 1968, popularized this idea that zombies were slow. And this is when cybersecurity best practice was written down. And people just treated it as gospel, and they've just continued with that pretty much since. But actually, zombies were fast. They were quite fast. So no one really updated the best practice. So zombies started to get fast in Return of the Living Dead in 1985. And so this sort of continued with films and games like 28 Days Later, World War Z, The Last of Us, etc. So when the zombie apocalypse happened, the zombies took everyone by surprise and they just ate everyone. That's basically what happened. So as a very, very quick example, I'll tempt fate and see if we can do some audience interaction. So this zombie is going to eat all of you in about 3 seconds unless you can guess what is the fastest growing form of credential theft. So just yell out if you think you have an answer. So, info stealers is close as far as how are the info stealers doing it? Phishing? No. Another guess? What was that? MFA tokens? No. Kind of. But okay, that's the 3 guesses. Okay, so what we've done is we've basically sort of looked at about 3,000 different attacks, mapped them all to MITRE ATT&CK, and so interestingly, the fastest growing, it's not the most prevalent, but the fastest growing form of credential theft ends up being credentials from web browsers. And the info stealer point was actually pretty spot on. So as far as why this is the case, we have this big info stealer ecosystem that is now a thing. And if you think about it, so most info stealers, they do have capability to steal credentials from most modern browsers. If you're an attacker sort of external to the network, you're generally going to be using the internet to get to the network that you're looking to hack. And where the internet is, there's usually a browser. And people will often save credentials in browsers just for convenience sake. If you drop Mimikatz in an environment that has some level of detections, you should get picked up pretty quick. Stuff like that will stand out, but info stealers, at least at this stage, don't really. And taking from browsers, again, doesn't. So if you are an attacker, you're going to go where there are plentiful credentials that's already in a place that you're going to be, and there's not really a lot of detection for it. It's just an absolute no-brainer for you. So the threat landscape, as we can see, is changing. Things are getting, you might say, faster, the zombies are getting faster. So since the threat landscape is always changing, we need a constantly updated zombie survival kit. So don't just assume that you know as far as we know what the threats are that are out there. Actually go look and actually see what they are. So this is threat-informed defense. Threat-informed defense is basically a systematic application of an understanding of adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures, so TTPs, I'll use that term a little bit, to strengthen defenses. That's really all it is. So you start with intelligence. That will tell you what it is that you should be building as far as what attacks do we need to be mitigating, what stops that, so what do we actually put in place for defenses. And then you have testing come in to test to make sure the defenses you've built actually function. That testing will find issues, and by this point there'll be new intelligence that comes in. So you now have new things to build, and you test them again, and then you build new things and you get more intelligence, and you go through this continuous cycle. There's a blog post there if you are at all interested in reading more about it. Okay, so first you need intelligence. People hear this term intelligence and they think of it as this sort of scary, dark art. It's actually really approachable. Really, all intelligence is it's information about the real world that helps a decision maker make a better decision. That's actually it. And in this instance, as far as like cybersecurity, what you should be looking at is so what threat actors are targeting your industry and your geography. So let's say you work for a bank here in New Zealand. So looking at who targets banks in Oceania, that's kind of who you want to be looking at as far as your threat actors. And we have a saying in intelligence, the way you predict the future is you look at the past. So the reason behind this, let's say you work for a hospital. The reason that you are quite a good target is because you have this confluence of things. You've got patients that have quite sensitive information that you are holding. You're probably under budgeted as far as what you have for your security and general IT. And you've also got this sensitivity to uptime because the network, either directly or indirectly through processes and that kind of stuff, is supporting the health and sometimes the very lives of people. Now, that's not going to change tomorrow. Tomorrow, you're still going to probably be under budgeted. Tomorrow, you're still going to have this sensitive data, and tomorrow, your network is still going to be just as sensitive to uptime. So the reason you got targeted in the past is probably the reason you're going to get targeted in the future. So that's sort of how you look at what's going to happen down the track. Now, gathering intelligence can be as simple as literally just having a reminder in your calendar so every 6 months, just go, look, I'm just going to spend a day, I'm just going to go read a couple of news articles as far as recent attacks that were in my industry and my geography and sort of look at what the actual techniques were. Or it can be as bespoke as having a vendor actually go and sort of create reports for you. And intelligence should have 3 levels. So it should have strategic, operational, and tactical levels to it. So if you look at strategic, so strategic can be something as far as, so we are seeing sort of broad trends as far as we're targeted by particular threat actors. They have a certain level of sophistication. Therefore, as part of the business strategy, we're going to budget a certain amount to make sure that we can sort of keep across that. Operational can be, okay, so we're looking at broad trends. We are seeing the certain threat actors that are targeting us continuously. Therefore, as a security operations manager, I'm going to make sure that our security operations has coverage for those particular techniques that we know are going to be used. And tactical can be, well, we're seeing these particular TTPs that are being used in a sequence continuously. So when we threat hunt, that's what we're going to look for. Now, I can hear some people saying, well, okay, look, we have intelligence. We have a feed of IOCs. So we've got IP addresses, file hashes, domains. We've got intelligence. So the point I'm trying to make here is you can't plan business strategy around malicious IP addresses. That's not really intelligence. It might tell you something to block, but it's not something you can sort of do wider planning around. You can't plan security operations solely around blocking file hashes. And you can't or shouldn't plan the day-to-day of your analysts and just blocking sort of atomic indicators. So okay, we've looked at what the techniques are. How does this actually help us? So MITRE ATT&CK is sort of the key thing here. So it's just a big list of hacking techniques. The key thing is it is techniques that are real world. So nothing gets added to attack unless it's actually been seen out there in the real world. And the lovely thing for us is it gives us a common language that we can use so that we can all talk about these things collectively. But it also gives us these mitigations and detections. It does this nice mapping for us. So for example, we have a particular TTP here, valid accounts. So for each TTP, it has these entries. So it'll have sort of the name of the entry. It'll have any sub-techniques if they're applicable. It will then have an actual, a real-world grounding. So it'll give you some examples as far as how it's been used in the real world. So you sort of have some context as far as, okay, this is how it actually has played out. And then it has your mitigations and detections. So for valid accounts, it has things like conditional access as a mitigation. And then for detection, it will talk to the logs and even sort of the field in the log that you need as far as interacting with accounts, so to making sure you're logging things like account logins and that kind of stuff. And so that's literally it. You understand your threat landscape as far as like who's going to be targeting you. You look at what techniques they're using, and then you use these mappings to figure out sort of what controls we should have in place. That's kind of like it end to end. Okay, so now we build our defenses. So this can be like people, processes, technology. So this is not just putting in place a tool and that's that. There can be sort of lots of different things that sort of go into it. And the key thing as far as if you run a SOC yourself, or if you have an outsourced provider that's doing that for you, Security Operations Center, you want to make sure that you've got the logs so that you can actually pick up the TTPs that are going to be applicable to you. There's no point sort of having that service unless it has the visibility that it needs to detect the things that you need it to be detecting. Okay, and then you test your defenses. So this can be as far as having like a red team, having a purple team, having adversary emulation, sort of like whatever you want to call it, but it's just testing the actual defenses you put in place. And the key thing is literally testing those defenses. So using something like, I'll give an example as far as like MITRE Caldera that lets you actually emulate particular TTPs. What you don't want to have is you don't want to have a vendor that's going to come in, or even sort of an internal team, whoever it is. You don't want them to come in and just go, okay, well, I'm just going to do just some basic techniques because I know how to hack. And then that's not actually testing what you built. And if you've done your work, you know you've built the right stuff. You've built these defenses that are going to be protecting you against what's actually occurring out in the real world. So you want the actual testing to make sure that you're testing the right stuff. And that's literally it. So that's your zombie survival kit. So again, so threat-informed defense. So the definition is you systematically apply an understanding of tactics, techniques, and procedures, and so these adversary tradecraft, to your defenses, to how you're going to strengthen your defenses. So you want to gather intelligence, and that can be as simple as sort of just going and just having a bit of a read around, making sure you've got the right TTPs that you are making sure that you've got controls in place for. You then build those defenses. You then have testing that's going to test what it is specifically that you've built. That testing will find issues. You've now got new defenses to build. There'll be new intelligence that comes in. So you've now got more stuff to build as well. And you keep sort of going through this cycle. And if this happens to be old hat, if you're already sort of across all this, so the next thing that MITRE has brought out recently is flows. So MITRE brought this out in July, so pretty recent. Basically, rather than looking at a TTP in isolation, it basically looks at TTPs as a string of things that someone will do. So for example, if someone's going to exploit a publicly facing web application, and they're then going to scan your network, and then they're going to use SSH to start moving to the devices that they found. So basically looking at what the chain or flow of actions looks like, overlaying that onto your environment, and then basically building out your defenses that way. So that is it. I don't know if we have time for questions or if we have the next speaker that needs to come on. But if there's any questions, feel free to sing out. Otherwise, more than happy to have a chat after, during the breaks or anything like that. Feel free to come and have a chat. So.
Thank you, Kade. We do have a few minutes for questions, if you're willing to take them.
Yeah, if anyone wants.
Yeah? If we can have a few house lights, I can see hands. I'll wander around with the microphone. There are lights. You do exist. Are there any questions? I can see a hand. I'm going to go and walk towards the hand. Kade, there's a question.
Go for it.
It's over this way. Here we go. Here was the hand here.
Hello.
Yes.
Are you seeing for info stealers more with browser plugins, or is it apps, or is it drive-bys from web page visits? How are they getting the data from browsers?
So specifically what we're seeing with Stealers, it's not so much plugins. That is sort of what's happening separately as far as there can be like vulnerabilities with plugins and that kind of stuff. So things being taken from plugins is kind of like its own ecosystem. What we're seeing with Stealers is the Stealers just have native functionality where they just go, okay, cool, like we know where the actual credentials are saved as far as sort of just the file path for the particular browser. Often they are encrypted, but that encryption key is pretty easy to usually get as well. So they just know where like the encryption key is stored here, like decrypt these creds, pass them off to like a Telegram account or wherever the info stealer is sending them. So normally it's just straight from the browser itself. There is stuff that's happening from plugins, but that's kind of like its own separate thing. But yeah, at least as far as like that's what we've seen as far as the attacks that we've sort of analyzed. So yeah. So, sorry? Secure browsers? So I guess, like a lot of the main browsers are sort of like based on sort of like particular code bases, and they're pretty well understood as far as like how they save things. So it's a little bit difficult as far as there are different browsers that are out there, but I definitely couldn't recommend a specific one. Like the market sort of changes quite a lot. I think the solve for this problem is just don't save credentials in browsers. Like the save would be use a password manager that's separate from the browser itself. Yeah, I mean, anything that's going to make an attacker's life harder, as far as like conditional access, MFA, that kind of stuff, like that is all stuff that like we should definitely be using. Yeah.
Cool. There's a question over here.
Hello. You mentioned browsers. Is it like focus on web or is it focus on mobile? Because most of the people are using mobile nowadays and saving the passwords either in a browser or in a secret key. For example, if it's Samsung, then they used to have a pass key to save password.
Yeah, so the attacks we're looking at cover both mobile and sort of like just normal desktops. Like basically MITRE has two different frameworks. So they have like enterprise that sort of covers sort of your general IT. They then have mobile, and they've got others that sort of cover like iOS, they cover ICS and all that kind of stuff. But as far as like mobile, they have a specific framework for it. We cover, as far as the stuff we've looked at, covers both. And it's a case of like, people are using like browsers, they're storing stuff in browsers on both their mobile and desktops. So it's kind of a problem in sort of both places. So
Any other hands?
I think there's one at the back.
There's one at the back. Where did it go? Oh, I see it. Thanks.
Hi. Yeah, I just had a question about the MITRE framework, I guess, because I might have missed. Did you say it was publicly available, or?
It is, yes.
Yeah, but wouldn't that mean that attackers also have access to it?
They do, yes.
So they would know our strategy to combat them, and then it sort of feels like we always end up on the back foot in that case.
That's true. But even if it was closed, that would still be the case. Because,
True.
I mean, if you take like, if you look at just open source and closed source software, I mean, like, one is not necessarily more secure than the other as far as like, sure, open source, you can find all the bugs, but I won't name any particular vendors, but I mean, there's certain closed source edge devices that get attacked quite a lot, continuously, one might say. So I guess like keeping that information hidden doesn't actually help us in any way. They're still going to know, and at the end of the day, the controls you put in place are not necessarily impacted by the adversary's knowledge. So if it's like, if the adversary knows you can put in place conditional access, there's still conditional access. They still need the conditional access. They still need to actually like go through another check now to then bypass that, which is possible. But it's just another thing that makes their life harder. And for most adversaries, unless they're targeted, but most adversaries, it's a case of like, who's easiest to go after? Like, I've worked in SOCs where literally like, it would have just taken an adversary, like a brute force campaign, it would have just taken them to spoof the country they were coming from to get into a customer, and they just didn't bother. And they didn't bother because they were getting in elsewhere. They had other people that they were hitting, and so it just wasn't even worth literally just like spinning up a VPN to then like have their attacks coming out of. So just make things harder for them, and then you will mitigate at least some level of the problem.
Right, I gotcha. I suppose the concern I'm more speaking toward is blind spots. If we go off of some sort of standard, if we think, oh yeah, well, the MITRE framework is great for dealing with things, I'll just follow that. It leaves us open to not checking everything, I guess.
It definitely does. Like, groupthink is a thing, but I would say that groupthink is probably a smaller problem than people just having a scattershot approach and not being systematic and missing a bunch of stuff. So currently, sort of the current situation is like people just do kind of whatever. Some people are doing it systematically. Some people are putting it in with what level of budget they have. Some people don't have capabilities. Some people don't have skills. So it's a case of like what gets put in place is quite random. I think a systematic approach, while it would have some problems, it's probably a smaller problem than the current problem we have, if that makes sense. So, but it is a good point. So.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Any hands? There's a hand here. Hello.
Speaking of open source, do you have like a recommended public feed or sort of reporting repository for people to look up at and just look at novel threats?
Yeah, so I guess there's nothing, I guess I run a company, I won't advertise it. I can't sort of recommend any particular vendors per se, but what I would say is like what we do is we look at a lot of the news feeds. Like there's no one place that we go. We sort of go like wherever there's reporting on anything. You will be able to find, like, if you're sort of like keeping across the news, you'll see that there's some places that are better than others that are reporting. I guess in general, I would probably say steer away from some of the bigger names that sort of do more broad news, because that is probably going to be a shallower reporting, because cybersecurity is just going to be a subset of the broader stuff they do. If you go to some of these more like specialized news outlets that have a lot more detailed write-ups, and I just keep across that kind of stuff. Like, there's nothing that I would say to be like, oh, this is the source of truth and just go there. Like, I think it's just like, look at stuff in aggregate and sort of do that collection, sort of go through that process, because that will really teach you as far as like, oh, this is sort of what's happening day to day as far as the general cadence of things. So.
Thank you. One more question.
There's one over.
There's a hand over there.
Yes.
Great.
They're making you walk.
They are. I guess that's my job today. Here we go.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the talk. Just as a response to the last question, maybe I'd suggest talkback.sh. It's an aggregator for threat intel and articles, probably a good place to look at.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
run by a consultancy in Canberra called the Elton Group, so it's talkback.sh.
Cool. Thank you very much, Kade.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Much appreciated.
I am a super genius.